Okay, today we go on to chapter 8 of SD 41 or SD 41.8. Cūḻa Assa Pura Sutta M40 Majjhima Nikaya, middle length suttas, number 40. Cūḻa means lesser, so we translate the sutta name as the Lesser Discourse at Assapura. Assapura is the name of a market town in Anga. Anga is one of those kingdoms. It was in the Buddhist time. It was under the rule of Magadha. So very often they form a twin kingdom called Anga Magadha. This sutta is one of a pair. The other is called Maha Sapura Sutta. That is Sutta M39. They both more or less talk about the same thing. What makes a recluse? In this sutta, Cūḻa Assa Pura Sutta, the Buddha talks about the nature of a true recluse, or as the Pali term here goes, Samana Samichi Patipada, the proper way of a recluse. In other words, what is the proper conduct of a recluse? In fact, in this sutta, the Buddha, the key idea here is that a holy man is not defined by his externalities. A recluse or holy man is not by looks or by vows, in other words. That's the key idea. In the Maha Sapura Sutta, the theme is what makes a recluse and what makes a Brahmin. Right? So in other words, the Buddha is defining the true spiritual person. Not someone who is born holy, not someone by status, but because of the person's practice and true conduct. So here again we see, in other words, a kind of teaching on the training of a recluse, the gradual way, and so on. The main idea is the same, that of gradual training, but the theme focuses on the nature of a true recluse. Well, let's look at the sutta. The transition begins on page 91. So as usual, you see the Buddha traveling. See the Buddha moving around the central Gilgit plain, and here you will find him in Anga, in the market town of Assapura. Thus have I heard, at one time the Blessed One lived amongst the Angas. There was a market town named Assapura. Notice the sutta says there was a market town named Assapura. In other words, the Buddha did not live in the town itself. He normally would stay outside in the quiet forest or some kind of grove, a peaceful place, in other words. Of course, the Buddha sometimes would be invited for alms, offering, and there he would give Dhamma talks too. So there the Blessed One addressed the monks, Bhikshus. Bhante, the monks replied to the Blessed One in essence. The Blessed One said this: Recluse, recluse, samana. Bhikshus, so people perceive you. And when you are asked, who are you? You claim we are recluses. Bhikshus, since you are designated so and you declare so, you should train yourself thus. We will practice the proper way of a recluse. This way, the designation of ours would be true and this claim would be real. And whatever robes, alms food, lodging, and support for the sick and medicinal requisites we use would bring us great fruit, great benefit, so that this going forth of ours will not be fruitless, or will not be barren, but be fruitful and fertile. So here we have kind of the thesis, the main idea here, right? So the Buddha says, well, you regard yourself as a recluse or holy man. Other people also regard you so. So make sure you live up to it, basically, right? And here, specifically mentioned are the four supports, the four basic supports of the life of a recluse: robes, alms food, lodging, and health supports. Or in simple terms, food, clothing, shelter, and health. Use this properly, the Buddha says. In other words, you don't become a recluse to get these things, but you become a recluse to be awakened. And these are the four things that support you or support us as renunciants. So use them wisely, then you will get the full benefit, in other words, awakening. Then the Buddha goes on to give in detail the definition of a recluse. The first part, as usual, would be the negative aspect. And then the last part is the positive aspect. Okay? Now, the first section is called the stains of a recluse, 3.1. These are the negative aspects of a recluse. And how bhikshus is a monk, not accomplished in the proper way of a recluse. Bhikshus, whichsoever monk is covetous, whose covetousness is not abandoned, who has ill will, whose ill will is not abandoned, who has anger, whose anger is not abandoned, who is grudging or resentful, and whose grudge is not abandoned, who is scornful or contemptuous, whose scorn is not abandoned, who is spiteful or malicious, and whose spite is not abandoned, who is envious, whose envy is not abandoned, who is stingy or selfish, whose stinginess is not abandoned, who is deceitful or dishonest, and whose deceit is not abandoned, who is fraudulent or hypocritical, and whose hypocrisy is not abandoned, and who has bad wishes or evil desires, whose bad wishes are not abandoned, who has wrong views, whose wrong views are not abandoned. So here we have 12 negative qualities. Now, when we first look at it, we might say, oh, these are almost like a random set, if you like. But if you look carefully, you find the first two and the last, they are also found in the later systematic sets of, for example, the what I call the 10 fetters, and so on, right? Covetousness, for example, is desire for what other people have, or generally desire, if you like. And then opposite of that is ill will. So these two are often found together, like a shorthand for the 10 fetters or the 5 hindrances, and so on. And the last item, number 12 here, is very common. We also found, for example, in the 10 wrong causes of action. So this is a kind of some key negative behavior which the Buddha says should not be found in a monk. Now once you have this kind of almost random list, we have a good idea. This sutta is probably early, where the most glaring mistakes or bad habits or negative qualities are listed. And then slowly all this thing becomes more systematic as we go along through the years as the Buddha teaches the Dharma. But basically, we can say even in one sentence, the Buddha might say, a true recluse, a monk who is a true recluse, would not conduct himself in a wrong way, right? But that's not very helpful, it's too general. So here the Buddha gives very common mistakes we see in someone who's negative, right? You have full of desire for what other people have, ill will, anger, grudge, scorn, spite, envy, stinginess, deceit, fraud, bad wishes, or bad desires, and wrong views, right? So these are called stains. This is what kind of spoils the training of a spiritual person. This is what makes a monk or a nun or a monastic look bad, in other words. Bhikshus, on account of not abandoning these stains of a recluse, faults of a recluse, drags of a recluse, grounds for downfall or loss, to be experienced in suffering states. He has not practiced the proper way of the recluse, I say. Right? So the Buddha says if a holy man or someone who claims to be a holy man, a monk, a nun, has all this, any of these 12 qualities, this is called a stain, it's a fault. Now, dregs, D-R-E-G-S, dregs are the impurities. You know, when you melt metal, you see the impurities floating on the top, that's called dregs. Grounds for downfall or loss. In other words, this person won't progress spiritually. And to be experienced in suffering states. So after the person passes away, even in the next life, the rebirth will be negative. Section 4. Bhikshus, like a weapon called mataja, meaning the death bringer, double-edged and whetted sharp, wrapped and folded in his sangati or upper robe. Even so, bhikshus, is this going forth of a monk, I say. Wow, notice what is said here. This is a very general statement. It says, becoming a monk, going forth as a monk, renouncing as a monk, is like, you're like wearing, you have this weapon, very sharp, double-sided weapon, called a mataja. I don't know exactly what it is. It could be like a sharp weapon being thrown both sides, maybe kind of like a sword or some kind of very sharp double-sided weapon. And this is wrapped in a robe. So, I mean, you can get caught, you know, even if you wrap such a sharp weapon with a piece of cloth. So here the Buddha is warning, saying that just because a monk or monastic wears a robe doesn't mean he's holy. You could get yourself into a lot of serious trouble. Buddha Gosha, for example, has his own idea about this, the danger of being a monastic and not practicing properly. Right? He says if you were a follower of, say, other religions, and you don't follow the training, you just pretend to be good, it's like, you know, falling from a horse or a donkey. But it's not too bad, you know. I mean, it's still bad if you, if the horse is a tall horse. But it says if you become a monastic, a monk or a nun, and you do not practice the teaching, you break the rules or you pretend to be holy, it's like falling from an elephant. And imagine an elephant is quite high, you know, like 6, 7 or 8 feet high, or even higher. This person falls from an elephant, so it's going to really hurt himself. It might even be dangerous or fatal even. So you have this kind of warning the Buddha is giving. It's like they're saying the shadow is darkest where the light is brightest. In other words, when you take a vow to be a monk and you don't practice it, of course, the fruits of it is very painful. Sooner or later, it will come. So then the Buddha goes on to be, the next section, it says that a recluse or a holy man is not how he looks. A holy man is not defined by external looks, by what he wears, or by the vows that he takes. Here the Buddha talks about 10 kinds of holy men in the Buddha's time. Okay? Section 5. Bhikshus, there is no recluseship in the sangati wearer. No recluseship. That means you are not a recluse just because you wear sangati. Sangati basically is the outer robe of a monk or a holy man. merely on account of wearing a sangati, I say, right? Just because someone wears a robe doesn't make him a monk. Bhikshus, there is no recluseship for a naked ascetic, merely on account of nakedness, I say. Right, so here we have another group of holy men in the Buddha's time, or even today. They do not wear anything, because they feel that, you know, if you want to really renounce the world, you should give up everything, even clothing, because then you don't have any pockets to keep money, for example. There's nothing great here, because these naked ascetics, they also, like, you know, they don't wash, and they rub themselves with ashes. They look kind of grey, you know, like those ashes from wood after it's burnt, and their whole face and everything will be kind of ashen. So they look quite scary, actually. And they don't go, you don't really find them where lots of people. They will live in very quiet, remote areas. So the Buddha says, even by nakedness, you know, it doesn't make you body. Number 3, bhikshus, there is no recluseship in one living in dust and dirt. So here again we see this naked ascetic, as I mentioned, they will rub themselves with dirt. So there will a layer of mud or dirt which is thickened. You know, you don't wash, when you sweat, you find that there's a layer of dirt. And imagine you don't wash for weeks, days, months, years, you know, and you get this thick layer of dirt all around you. So, in other words, such people look different from the so-called normal people. And we tend to, sometimes, in India at least, they tend to look up to people who are different as being holy, right? Of course, in Singapore you're different, you'll be thrown in prison, you know? You got to be behave like everyone else. But in this ancient society, religious society like India, they regard such people as special. Right? It's a very interesting cultural tradition, or cultural tendency. Number 4, bhikshus, there is no recluseship for a ritual bather, merely on account of ritual bathing, I say. Ritual bathing here is what we today know as baptism, ritual washing, holy washing, sacred washing, right? We have, for example, this Sundarika Bharadwaja, who is one of those, one of the earliest Baptist Brahmin, if you like. He would regularly dip himself into the water, into the river, sacred rivers. Even today you find some of these religious people in India dipping themselves into the water and then coming out cleansed. That's the kind of idea they believe in. And then you find in the Middle East also, they have a similar practice of dipping themselves into the water, into the river, into some kind of water, even the sea, and they come out kind of purified or saved and so on. So the Buddha says, no, but just this kind of ritual, it doesn't make you pure. Rituals don't make us pure. So here we must remind ourselves, there are also no such thing as karma purifying rituals. Sometimes you hear this being said. So if you really respect the sutta, or you know the sutta, you will know that there's something wrong. And when someone says you can purify your karma through rituals, no rituals can help us. We only correct ourselves through our own behavior. In fact, it's very dangerous to say we are purified by rituals. Imagine if you've done something wrong and then you perform a ritual and you say, okay, I'm pure now. And then you tend to go back to what you have done before and then come back for the ritual again. And so it's a very dangerous situation here. So it's better to train ourselves not to get caught up with a negative act, or find out the conditions that led to this kind of action. And then practice something that will correct ourselves, better ourselves, in other words. Number 5. 5 and 6 kind of go together. Number 5, bhikshus, there is no recluseship for a tree root dweller, merely on account of dwelling at the tree root, I say. Dwelling at the foot of a tree, right? This is one of the practices of the 13 strict asceticism. Later on, the Buddhists also adopt this, but the Buddha said this is not compulsory, they're optional. So in other words, we have clues here where this kind of practice, the tree root dweller or someone who takes refuge or has a habit of dwelling under a tree or at the foot of a tree, is a very ancient practice, pre-Buddhist practice if you like. Then later some of the monks felt that they want to live this kind of life because it's very convenient to live under a tree, especially a big tree is quiet and remote, and in a sense it's quite safe to practice there. But it doesn't define a holy man, right? So when you see someone sitting in a tree practicing, doesn't mean he's a holy man. You've got to find out, is this person really a holy man? By asking Dharma questions, by watching their behavior and so on. Number 6. Bhikshus, there is no recluseship for an open-air dweller, merely on account of living in the open, I say. So this is another of the 13 strict rules for the Thanga monks. They live in the open, right? So obviously this kind of practice, you've got to live in a place with suitable climate. You know? I mean, if it is all the time snowing or raining, it's going to be very difficult. So this is the kind of strict rule this person observes. Of course, such people normally they will observe either for a certain time, or some of them even observe it for life. So these are some things that, as the Buddha says, it is optional, right? Because they don't really, by themselves, they don't really define spirituality or even recluseship. However, if you practice this with a proper understanding of leading a simple life, learning to restrain yourself, it may help. In other words, you somehow are naturally able to live such a life. It doesn't harm you in any way. Number 7. Bhikshus, there is no recluseship in an upright stander, merely on account of standing upright, I say. Right, so this is a very interesting kind of recluse. This person will stand all his life. I've seen this picture of this person on a video once in India. It seems that it's still practiced today. This person, he's not really standing upright because someone tied a kind of sling for him from a tree, and there's a small piece of plank there, and he will put his arm there, and he stands like that. So there's a bit of support to help him stand. So he doesn't actually stand like a soldier on his life. So there's a bit of support, but it's still defined as standing anyway. One can imagine, how the answers nature's call, things like that. So he's kind of standing there all the time, and he's kind of regarded as holy. But here the Buddha says, no, there is no recluseship in such a person. In fact, the person is socially useless. I mean, it's very difficult for him to teach the Dharma. Or what Dharma can he teach? It's not learn anything or realize anything. It's just by his ritual. So number 8, bhikshus, there is no recluseship for a regimented eater, merely on account of regimented eating, I say. Okay, this one is probably a reference to a special kind of Jain monks, or those who eat food in a measured way. Maybe only certain days they'll eat something, or they'll only eat so many spoonfuls, or even so many grains of rice or whatever. Remember, there's something mentioned about this in the life of the Buddha, how when he tortured himself during the days when he was practicing asceticism. So here again, another kind of asceticism, self-torture. In other words, what you eat or even how you eat does not define your spirituality, does not make you a holy person. It's how you conduct yourself. I mean, you can be a vegetarian, but then you can be very violent, right, to other people. Then number 9, bhikshus, there is no recluseship for a mantra reciter, merely on account of reciting mantras. Well, here we can take this as a kind of a reference to the Brahmins who lead a holy life, who claim they are holy because they know some ancient secret teachings. No one else knows, only they know because it's handed down through their families. and these are meant to be for blessings, things like that. And of course, this, if you look at early Buddhism, you can say this also includes reciting sutras, like mantras. In other words, taking sutras to be magical chants for apotropic purposes, in other words. So you're treating them as mantras. The irony of it all is, in the centuries after the Buddha, the later centuries especially, you find Buddhism slowly becoming more Brahminized. So the monks kind of meditated less, so they began to chant more, and they became so. And this kind of monks today, you see them as scholars more than anything else. And in Sri Lanka, it's a very common trend. So you find there are not many well-known or good meditators from the Sri Lankan tradition, for example. You find the well-known meditation and meditators and meditation teachers are in the quieter parts of Myanmar or in the northwest, northeast, northern areas of Thailand. So these are the forest tradition. So this, those who don't meditate, they recite, right? Adhyaya, in Sanskrit, adhyaya or ajaya in Pali. And again, ironically, in the later Sri Lankan texts, the chronicles, for example, the adhyaka, the reciter, the word also is used for a teacher. Right? So we can see, in other words, the trend towards kind of mantra recitation of the Brahmins has caught up with Buddhism, so to speak. So these are things we have to be careful about, it to be kind of avoid if we want to really practice the Buddha's teaching. We should not treat suttas like magical chants, or we should not treat suttas like magical chants only, in other words. For example, of course, we could, for a simple person who is not educated, who won't understand the suttas, we can chant some simple blessings. But it is very important to impress on this person that the person's actions are important. It's not just, this blessing doesn't empower a person. It is your own action that empowers you. So you don't even need anyone to chant for you, in other words. Of course, there are people who might say, oh, you know, Buddhist chants have no power because we talk like this. But that's not the point here. The point here is we do not want people to have a wrong idea that you can chant, you can recite the words. Then you have priest. Priest means someone do the work for you. Instead of you taking your medicine, it is like someone is taking your medicine, but you are the one who's sick. So you have to practice yourself, you have to take the medicine yourself, so that you will be cured of your pains and ills and suffering. And in that way you awaken, you will be free from suffering. And the last one, number 10, bhikshus, there is no recluseship in a matted hair ascetic, merely on account of having matted hair, I say. In the Buddha's time, this is a well-known group of holy men. They keep their hair long and unwashed, and this big kind of hairstyle. And imagine they don't wash it, so creatures living there too. So basically what the Buddha is saying, you should keep yourself clean and looking calm and happy. So the monks shave their hair, live simple lives, and practice the teaching, right? So these 10 kinds of recluses or holy men, they show externally the signs of holiness, but inwardly we do not know what they are. So the Buddha says, no, this is like, another way of looking at these people is they are attached to rituals and vows. They will never become even streamliness. So it's not by ritual, in other words. So for lay Buddhists, in other words, we have to be careful not to cut up with rituals too. I mean, just because, let's say, we do our puja every day, on the dot, without fail, and we chant so many suttas, doesn't mean we are on the way to awakening, not at all. right? We might one day say, oh, I'm tired of chanting, and you give it up. It is your understanding nature of speech in your body and restraining the actions of your body through the first 3 precepts, right? Understanding nature of speech, restraining it through the 4th precept, and then keeping your mind calm and clear through keeping the 5th precept, not taking drugs and drinks, not getting intoxicated, and so on. And then whenever you can, learning to calm yourself, learning to be happy inwardly, especially through meditation. And then reading the suttas. There are so many so-called Buddhist books nowadays, some written by non-Buddhists, because Buddhist books seem to sell well, certain kinds of Buddhist books. And the more you read such books, the more confused you'll be. I mean, some of these books, yes, may support your ideas and say, wow, this is a great book. But then you are caught in a loop without any spiritual growth. The idea is when you read something, especially suttas, you feel happy for a while. And then you use that happiness to calm yourself. And you go on like that. You keep on building up your peacefulness and happiness. And very soon you find that you don't really need to read any books. Or if you do read any books, you begin to see the beauty hidden in those books. Sometimes the beauty could be even not known by the writer themselves. You begin to appreciate what is really good, in other words. And you express that joy and happiness, and others also feel inspired by that kind of feeling, the attitude. So that's one simple way of talking about being spiritual, being holy, through your own practice and example. Not by wearing robes or looking different, and then going around walking like some Zen monk or some kind of holy man, or behaving like a Brahmin. People say, wow, he's a holy man. I mean, there's only external looks, but you don't know inside what kind of person this person is. For example, you find during World War II, even some of those calm-looking regimented monks or priests, rather than normal monks in Japan anyway, they actually supported the war efforts, right? So as Buddhists, we are pacifists. We don't support war. So you can see here, it's very troubling when you hear such things. So this is where you have to examine what kind of practice, conduct, way of thinking this holy man have, whether they are in keeping with the Buddha's teaching or not. If not, then we should not follow them, in other words. All this is clear. For example, if the Buddha goes on detail, for each of these 10, the Buddha mentions all the stains of a recluse again. So if you see this, you should not follow them. Take number 1. Recluseship is not merely the wearing of a sangati. 6.1. If bhikshus merely on account of wearing a sangati or upper robe, a sangati wearer who is covetous were to abandon covetousness, who has ill will were to abandon ill will, who has anger were to abandon anger, who is grudging were to abandon grudge, who is scornful were to abandon scorn, who is spiteful were to abandon spite, who is envious were to abandon envy, who is stingy were to abandon stinginess, who is deceitful were to abandon deceit, who is fraudulent were to abandon fraud, who has bad wishes were to abandon bad wishes, who has wrong views were to abandon wrong views. Then when he is born, friends and colleagues, relatives and blood relations would only need to make him a sangati wearer and have him take upon himself that sangati wearing thus, come now Bhadramukha, or good face, lucky face, be a sangati wearer. Okay, this is a bit long-winded sentence, né? So let's simplify it. The Buddha says, if merely wearing a robe, just putting on a robe, like you see some of those children's wizard story and movies, right? Just by wearing a robe, you disappear. Or wearing a robe, you look bright or happy. You know? But here, the moment you wear a robe, you overcome all these 12 stains. Right? You have no more covetousness, you have no more ill will, no more anger, no more bad character, all the bad stuff, all those things are gone. So wow, if that really happens, then the moment a child is born, you should, let this child wear this sangati. And then the parents will say, oh, you lucky face one, Bhadramukha, see? Wear this robe and you'll be a good person. And the family themselves, they all will wear that. Right? Isn't it wonderful? All you need to do is just wear the robe, if that's the case. So it's not simple as that. It doesn't work that way. You just don't put on a robe and you become holy. Same thing with the other 9 kind of things. So anyway, the Buddha continues by saying, the reality is, when you look around, you see these people who wear the robes, many of them don't practice, right? I mean, you can see around the urban area in Singapore, many people who wear the robes, they drive around in cars, they live in temples and monasteries with kind of recreation areas, even swimming pools and so on. And they kind of, basically they have bank accounts and they deal with money and so on. So they wear robes, but they are not religious people at all. So therefore the Buddha says there is no recluseship in a sangati wearer. You don't become holy just by wearing a robe. Then number 2, again here, naked asceticism, right? I mean, if just being naked means you're holy, then the moment a child is born, the relatives and the friends and so on could gather and just and make this baby remain naked all his life, so to speak, and they themselves follow the same example. But it doesn't happen that way. Right? People don't change by just following this kind of conduct. You find, the Buddha says, you'll see, you look around, you'll find some of these naked ascetics themselves have this kind of behavior, right? They show desire, they show ill will, jealousy, etc., etc., right? Of course, you may say, is this true? Well, you can go to India, you go to some of these holy places, maybe the city of Benares, that you find there are many areas there where at lunchtime, very pious lay people come, offer food to all these sadhus and these holy men, and you just watch their behavior. Okay? After that, you can just quietly follow them and then see how they behave, and you have some surprises. Number 3 is, so same thing, those living in dust, if this is really can change people to become holy men, become good. As soon as a child is born, you should make the child, cover the child with dust and dirt, and follow the same style, but that doesn't happen. And number 4, ritual bathing, right? So if ritual bathing can change the person, make a person holy, you can, the moment the child is born, do some kind of baptism ritual, and you yourself follow it, then you automatically become good and kind. You will find that's not the case. In fact, you find many of those people who are baptized or cleansed with water in this way, fighting in wars in our history, and killing people, massacring them even. Many of them went all over to, say, the Americas and exterminated so many tribes in South America. Right? So they were baptized soldiers. Right? They were the conquistadores, the Spanish. So they were really violent people. Then the next one, recluseship, it's not merely dwelling under a tree. So here again, if this is the case, in the moment the child is born, you can let the child live under a tree, for example. And the family could live under a tree, but they don't become holy people under a tree. And you still see these people who live at the foot of trees showing greed, anger, and other negative emotions. Number 6, recluseship is not merely living in the open air. So here again it's the same thing, right? If that's the case, then you could let this newborn child live in the open air, where you don't see this person becoming a holy man that way. And the same thing about standing upright. It's not just by merely doing that action as a ritual, it will change a person, make a person holy. If that's the case, then a newborn child could become holy too. But you see such people also, they still have negative emotions. Same thing with regimented eating. Right? If that's the case, you can treat the newborn child the same way. Give regimented eating style to this child. But the child does not change. Mantra reciting. Here again, we can, if this works, it makes you a holy man right away. You can raise the child teaching all these mantras. But you find that's not the case. Maybe when the child grows up, oh, I'm tired of mantras, I don't want to chant anymore. And then number 10, matted hair. So here again, of course the child doesn't have much hair, but you can kind of keep the child's hair and keep it unwashed so that it becomes matted and so on. But you won't make the child holy. So it's not by any of these external actions that make a holy person. So these are the negative qualities, right? So what are the positive qualities? The qualities of a true recluse. 7.1. And how bhikshus is a monk accomplished in the proper way of a recluse? Bhikshus, whichsoever monk was covetous, whose covetousness is abandoned, who had ill will, whose ill will is abandoned, who had anger, whose anger is abandoned, who was grudging, whose grudge is abandoned, who was scornful, whose scorn is abandoned, who was spiteful, whose spite is abandoned, who was envious, whose envy is abandoned, who was stingy, whose stinginess is abandoned, who was deceitful, whose deceit is abandoned, who was fraudulent, whose fraud or hypocrisy is abandoned, who had bad wishes or evil desires, and whose bad wishes are abandoned, who had wrong views, whose wrong views are abandoned. In other words, they were kind of negative before, but they changed. They bettered themselves. Bhikshus, on account of abandoning these stains of a recluse, faults of a recluse, drags of a recluse, grounds for downfall or loss to be experienced in suffering states, he has practiced the proper way of the recluse, I say. He sees himself purified of all these bad, unwholesome states. So, in other words, he calms himself, so, okay, I should not get angry, right? He practices that. And he knows that, he sees that. Seeing himself purified or freed of all these bad, unwholesome states, gladness arises in him. On account of gladness, zest arises. On account of a zestful mind, the body becomes tranquil, peaceful. On account of a tranquil body, he feels happy. In other words, body and mind calm, restful. On account of happiness, his mind attains samadhi. Right? So here, in other words, is a clear hint. Your meditation does not depend on rituals. It does not depend on any of these kinds of external looks or vows. Just as you are, you meditate by giving up these negative qualities. You look at yourself and say, well, I'm not being angry, I'm not showing hatred, you feel happy, you feel peaceful. Your mind feels peaceful. Then this number 8.5 is interesting, tranquil body. In other words, body and mind are all so peaceful. Here means you don't feel them anymore, they're at peace, all your five senses are at rest, so to speak. Then you are totally focused on your mind. And that's when samadhi arises. One pointedness or single focus of the mind. And the next thing, if you strive on, you get jhana. Here, the Buddha is probably talking to the Brahmins, so the Buddha goes on to talk about the 4 Brahma Viharas, starting with loving kindness, right? Section 9. With a heart of loving kindness he dwells, of using 1 quarter, the second, the third, the fourth, thus abiding, thus above, below, across, everywhere, and to everyone as well as to himself. he dwells suffusing the whole world with loving kindness, that is vast, exalted, boundless, without hate, without ill will. So loving kindness is spread out everywhere, without any limits. Then with the heart of compassion, he dwells suffusing one quarter, for example, the front quarter, right? And then the second quarter is the right-hand quarter, then the third quarter at the back, the fourth quarter on the left, and above, below, right? Here across is in the directions in between, and then everywhere, and to everyone as well as to himself. Don't forget yourself. He dwells suffusing the whole world with gladness that is vast, exalted, boundless, without hate, without ill will. So here it means cultivate this loving kindness and the other divine abodes to the level of jhana. And the last one, favorite gladness, 11. Then with the heart of gladness, he dwells suffusing one quarter, the second, the third, the fourth, thus above, below, across, everywhere, and to everyone, as well as to himself. He dwells suffusing the whole world with gladness, that is vast, exalted, boundless, without hate, without ill will. Notice the last two phrases, without hate, without ill will. That means with loving kindness, right? So here we see, in other words, loving kindness is the key practice. Loving kindness is the basis. When loving kindness, we begin by practicing loving kindness, showing it to everywhere, to everyone, everywhere. Then, number two, compassion is when loving kindness is shown to less fortunate people, people who are suffering, trouble. Then when loving kindness is shown to people who are successful and who are happy, you are happy because they're happy, through your loving kindness. And the fourth one, the most difficult level, that of equanimity, again, is using your loving kindness. You show equanimity, section 12. Then with the heart of equanimity, he dwells suffusing one quarter, the second, the third, and the fourth, thus above, below, across, everywhere. And to everyone as well as to himself, he dwells suffusing the whole world with equanimity, that is vast, exalted, boundless, without hate, without ill will. Then the Buddha gives a parable, the parable of a pleasant lotus lake. Bhikshus, just as there is a lotus lake with water clear, sweet and cool, with a beautiful stretch of pleasant white sand, and if a person were to come from the east, all scorched up, overcome by heat, tired, parched and thirsty, having come to that lotus lake, he would quench his thirst and feverish heat. And if he were to come from the west too, and if the man were to come from the north too, and if the man were to come from the south too, all scorched up, overcome by heat, tired and parched and thirsty, having come to that lotus lake, he would quench his thirst and feverish heat. Right? So here, in other words, this practice of the four divine abodes makes us feel so comfortable and happy. We free ourselves from suffering, or even if suffering does try to touch us, we are able to withstand it. Now the sutta is coming to an end already. The next section, the key idea is, any renunciant can be a recluse. Anyone who renounces the world can become a holy man, in other words. 13.8. Even so, bhikshus, if one comes from a kshatriya family, in other words, from royalty or ruling class, were to go forth as a renunciant from the household into homelessness and come to the Dhamma Vinaya declared by the Tathagata, having cultivated loving kindness, compassion, gladness, and equanimity in this way, he attains inner stillness. Right? So here you find these four divine abodes, when cultivated, help us to be internally calm, attain samadhi, in other words. Having been inwardly still, he is one who has practiced the proper way of a recluse, I say. So here is a very important note we should make, right? If you want to truly practice the Buddha's teaching, you should learn to calm yourself inwardly. Not just outwardly, outwardly we can pretend to be calm, but inwardly you must be calm also. In other words, at least free of greed, free of hate, and free of delusion whenever you can. I say whenever you can because delusion is a very tricky thing. We might not even know it is there. So we try our best, especially through meditation. We free ourselves from delusion by watching the breath, for example. And the same thing is said of the Brahmin, someone who comes from the priest class. If you renounce the world, you practice the teaching, and you cultivate the 4 divine abodes, beginning with loving kindness, and you have inner stillness, you have conducted yourself in the proper way as a recluse. And also a Vaishya, someone from the business class, who practices in the same way. A Shudra, the working class. In fact, anyone, right? Look at 13.20. If anyone from whatever family were to go forth as a renunciant from the household into homelessness and come to the Dhamma Vinaya declared by the Tathagata, having cultivated loving kindness, compassion, gladness, and equanimity in this way, he attains inner stillness. Having been inwardly still, he is one who has practiced the proper way of a recluse, I say. Now, a few important things must be noted here. Number one, the Buddha is not merely talking about the 4 classes here. The Buddha says anyone can become a recluse. Point number 2, the Buddha talks about the 4 divine abodes, loving kindness, and so on. Why I stress this? Because there are some teachers who tell you, you don't need to do loving kindness. In fact, you should not do loving kindness because it's a Brahmin practice. But you don't see here the Buddha saying that. In fact, the Buddha is saying here very clearly, if you practice the 4 divine abodes in this way and you attain inner stillness, you are a true recluse. Please note the Sutta, Cūḻa Assa Pura Sutta M40, section 13. Yeah? Then, in the closing part, the Buddha says, any recluse can awaken. Right? So you notice, anyone can become a recluse, any recluse can awaken. Meaning, if the recluse practices the teaching, not merely rely on externalities, looks, and vows. Look at 14.1. If one from a Kshatriya family, or that is from royalty or ruling class, were to go forth as a renunciant from the household into the homeless life, and having destroyed the mental influxes. Okay, mental influxes here refers to all those things that enter through our senses, the 5 senses, especially arousing desire, the desire for existence, and ignorance, causes ignorance in us. And later, views also is added in here, the 4 influxes. 3 were, in the ancient set, there are only 3. There is the influx of sensual desire, influx of existence, influx of ignorance. Then the later texts include views. In other words, whatever we experience through our senses that causes us to have more desires, that's not good. Whatever we experience through our senses make us become more and more of those things, and then we are reborn in those things, in hate, in greed, and so on. And then views, it makes us more views, and it keeps us in ignorance, right? So here, in the case of this Kshatriya who becomes a recluse, and he practices, and he has overcome all these mental influxes. In other words, sensual desire, existence, views, and ignorance. Having realized for himself, by direct knowledge, here and now, attains and dwells in the mental liberation and liberation by wisdom that is influx-free, he is a recluse on account of destroying the influxes. Here meaning he can either go into deep meditation and then attain even the formless realms, the jhanas and formless realms, then he is liberated both ways. In other words, to the body as well as overcoming all the defilements. So that's where he has great wisdom also. Right? Or he can just, let's say, meditate, get to some peaceful state of mind, and then overcome all these defilements. Same thing with the Brahmin. This also applies to the Vaishya or the business class. This applies to the Shudra or working class, or anyone from any family. When they renounce the world, the practice of teaching, they do their meditation, they overcome the mental influxes, they become arhats, in other words, and it doesn't matter where they come from. So the teaching ends there. The Blessed One said this, the monks joyfully approve of the Blessed One's word. So here, in summary, you see the Buddha saying that it is not how we look or the vows we take that define our holiness. We have to behave in such a way that we have no such a desire, no desire for money, for reclusities, no jealousy or any other kind of negative emotion, for the lay people especially. No ignorance, no wrong views, not believing in strange things, so on and so on. And this person is filled with the 4 divine abodes: lovingkindness, compassion, gladness, and equanimity. And then he overcomes the mental influxes, all those things that hold us on to suffering and to rebirth. That person is fully awakened. So the sutta ends there. So let us now close this with a reflection. Once again, this is a time we are reminded of the teaching of the Buddha that has come down to us through the ages, reminding us of the universality of truth and how we should practice without being caught up through superficiality, externality. In other words, we truly practice the teaching inside us. So each of us, we have to look for that inner peace, cultivate that inner peace, so that we are truly following the Buddha's teaching. Reflecting in this way is very good karma, but the power of all this karma may be in this life itself. Be well and happy. May our meditations be good in changing us to be better people. And most of all, by all these good deeds we have done, may we aspire to attain spiritual liberation, especially stream winning in this life itself. In this moment of peace, let us send out our loving kindness to all those people who have been kind to us, to all those people who are looking for the Dharma, that they may find the Dharma, to all beings, to all our loved ones, that they may be well and happy, especially to those people whom the Dharma have not touched, that they may see the Dharma and be well and happy and attain spiritual liberation themselves. May all beings be well and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.